A boyfriend wakes up bleeding in a parking lot. His head is throbbing. His vision is blurred. For a moment, he doesn't even know where he is. Then it hits him. He staggers to his feet, stumbles toward his car. The passenger door is hanging open. She's not there. He starts running. Through the dark, through the cold February air, blood dripping down the side of his face, soaking into his collar. He reaches her front door. He's pounding on it now, screaming her name. Her family pulls the door open and sees him standing there, barely able to stand, covered in blood, sobbing. It's February 1974 in Fort Worth, Texas. And somewhere out there, in the dark, a 17-year-old girl named Carla Walker is still alive. She has no idea that she has less than 48 hours left. And the man who took her? He's not a stranger passing through town. He's not someone who flees the state and disappears. He's going to walk free tonight. He's going to walk free for the next 46 years. He's going to live 4 miles from this family, close enough to drive past their house, for the next 3 decades, while they wonder, every single day, who did this to their daughter. It will take a piece of forensic technology that doesn't even exist yet, a DNA lab nobody's heard of, and a family that refuses to stop asking questions, to finally drag him out of the shadows. But by the time they catch him, it might already be too late to learn everything he's done. Welcome to XTC Uncovered. If this is your first time here, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because every week, we dig into the cold cases, the cover-ups, and the killers who thought they'd gotten away with it. And before we get into today's case, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this channel reaches. Today, we're uncovering the case of Carla Walker, a case that sat cold for nearly half a century, until DNA technology finally caught up to a killer who thought time was on his side. Let's go back to the beginning. It's February 16th, 1974. Western Hills High School in Fort Worth, Texas is hosting its Valentine's Day dance. Carla Jan Walker is 17 years old, a cheerleader, the youngest of 5 kids in a tight-knit family, standing not even 5 feet tall, but with a personality everyone described as tiny but mighty. She wants to be a veterinarian. Tonight, she's there with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, is senior on the football team. They've been dating for months. He's borrowed his mom's Ford LTD for the night. After the dance, they grab food, and then pull into the parking lot of the Brunswick Ridgely Bowl just to talk, just to spend a little more time together before the night ends. That's when everything changes. A man yanks open the passenger door. He pistol whips Rodney, again and again, until he's unconscious. And then he drags Carla out of the car, and into the night. The last thing Rodney remembers hearing, before everything goes black, is Carla screaming, "Rodney, go get my dad." This is where the story you just watched in our cold open actually begins. A bleeding boyfriend, a pounding fist on a front door, a family that will spend the next 46 years searching for an answer. And the man responsible? He's already disappearing back into the city, back into a normal life, a normal house, a normal name where he will stay hidden in plain sight for 3 decades. We'll get into exactly how investigators finally caught him, what he confessed to, and the disturbing question police are still trying to answer about whether Carla was his only victim. Coming up, Carla Walker was still alive. While her family sat frozen by the phone, while Rodney McCoy lay in a hospital bed with stitches closing the gash in his head, Carla was somewhere out there, in the hands of a man none of them had ever met. And she would stay that way, alive, terrified, alone for nearly 2 full days. Fort Worth police didn't know that yet. All they knew, in the first few hours, was that a teenage girl had vanished from a bowling alley parking lot, and that the only witness was a bloodied 17-year-old boy who couldn't remember the face of the man who took her. Detectives sat Rodney down for hours. They walked him through hypnosis sessions, trying to coax some buried detail out of his battered memory: a height, a voice, a scar, anything. Sketch artists worked alongside him, building composite after composite of a man who, in the end, looked like almost anyone. Officers canvassed the bowling alley, the parking lot, the surrounding streets. They found a discarded magazine from the attacker's pistol, dropped in the struggle. It was a clue, but it wasn't a name. Days passed with no leads, no calls, no breaks. And then, on the morning of February 20th, the silence ended in the worst possible way. A patrol officer searching the rural roads near Benbrook Lake spotted something in a drainage culvert, just off the pavement, miles from where Carla had last been seen. It was Carla. Sergeant Max Church was among the investigators who arrived at the scene that morning, and what he and his team found would haunt this case for decades. The medical examiner's findings, pieced together in the days after, painted a picture far more horrifying than anyone initially understood. Carla hadn't been killed that first night. She had been kept alive for almost 2 days after she was taken, beaten, sexually assaulted, and at some point injected with morphine, before finally being strangled and left in that culvert, less than 5 miles from the bowling alley where her night had started. The investigation that followed did what cold case investigations so often do. It turned inward, toward the person closest to the victim. Rodney McCoy, still recovering from his own injuries, still grieving the girl he loved, found himself under suspicion. Detectives followed the boyfriend playbook, the same one used in nearly every case like this one. Examine the person with no alibi first. Rodney had no alibi. He'd been unconscious. For years, that fact alone was enough to keep a shadow of doubt hanging over him, even as the physical evidence never tied him to the crime. It would take decades for that cloud to fully lift. But Rodney wasn't the only name that crossed detectives' desks in 1974. A local man named Glenn Samuel McCurley was brought in for questioning early in the investigation. He owned a .22 caliber pistol, the same caliber as the weapon used in the attack. Detectives sat him down, asked him about that night, about Carla, about the bowling alley. McCurley denied ever seeing her, denied any involvement at all. With no physical evidence linking him to the scene and no confession, investigators had nothing to hold him on. He walked out of that interview room a free man, and the case moved on without him. Years turned into decades. Leads dried up. Detectives changed. Carla's case slipped into the file of unsolved Fort Worth murders that everyone in the department knew, but nobody could crack. Then, in April of 2019, something strange surfaced. Fort Worth police released a letter, anonymous, decades old, sent to a detective sometime after the murder. The letter hinted that whoever wrote it knew something about Carla's death. Investigators made it public, hoping the author, or someone who recognized the handwriting, would come forward. They asked the public for help identifying who had sent it. Nobody ever did. The letter remains unexplained to this day, one more loose thread in a case already full of them. What nobody in Fort Worth knew, what nobody could have known, was that the man responsible for Carla's murder hadn't left town. He hadn't fled the state. He'd been living, quietly and unnoticed, just 4 miles from the family whose lives he'd shattered, for 30 years. It would take a laboratory hundreds of miles away, using science that didn't exist in 1974, to finally find him. By 2019, the physical evidence in Carla Walker's case had sat in storage for 45 years. A piece of her clothing, a bra strap, the very ligament used to end her life. For decades, that evidence had been tested and retested with whatever technology existed at the time, and every single time, it came back the same way: not enough. Too degraded. Too small a sample. Not enough genetic material to build anything investigators could use. But forensic science doesn't stand still, and somewhere along the way, a new kind of laboratory entered the picture. Fort Worth police shipped what remained of that evidence to Othram, a forensic genomics company based in the Woodlands, Texas, a lab that had built its entire reputation on doing what older labs couldn't: taking degraded, decades-old, barely their DNA, and coaxing a full genetic profile out of it. The cost of that kind of advanced testing wasn't cheap, and part of the funding for Carla's case came through the Oxygen Network, a television network that had taken an interest in cold cases just like hers. For the first time since 1974, scientists were able to build a complete DNA profile from the evidence on Carla's body. That profile became the key to everything that followed. Investigators used a process called forensic genetic genealogy, essentially building out a family tree using genetic markers, the same kind of process that had cracked other infamous cold cases around the country in recent years. They fed the profile in, and the tree began to grow. Branch by branch, name by name, the science narrowed an entire genetic pool down to a single family. 3 brothers, all with the surname McCurley. Detectives now had a direction for the first time in 46 years. They began quietly building a picture of each brother, their ages, their histories, where they'd lived in 1974, whether any of them had ever crossed paths with this case before. And somewhere in that process, one name stopped them cold. Glenn Samuel McCurley had been questioned by Fort Worth police in 1974. He'd owned a .22 caliber pistol. He denied ever knowing Carla Walker, and he'd walked free. 46 years later, he was still in Fort Worth. On September 21, 2020, the U.S. Marshals North Texas Fugitive Task Force moved on a 1-story home in far west Fort Worth. Leading the operation was Travis Edelman, a 22-year veteran officer who had spent decades tracking down people who thought they'd outrun their past. When the door opened, there was no chase, no struggle, no dramatic standoff. Just a 77-year-old man in a gray polo shirt, jeans, and dress shoes, standing in the doorway of the home he'd lived in for 30 years, completely undetected, completely unremarkable, a neighbor like any other on that street. Glenn Samuel McCurley had been living 4 miles from the Walker family this entire time. In the interrogation room, with decades of silence finally catching up to him, McCurley began to talk. What came out of his mouth that day would later be played for a jury, word for word, in a recording that would define the case against him. He admitted to taking advantage of her. He admitted to choking her to death. He tried, even then, even after everything, to minimize what he'd done, claiming he hadn't beaten her, brushing past the details of what the medical examiner had documented decades earlier. But buried in his rambling, qualified, almost reluctant confession was the admission that mattered most. He was guilty. For what happened to that little girl? Tarrant County prosecutors moved quickly to formally waive the death penalty, choosing instead to pursue a sentence of life in prison. McCurley was held on $500,000 bond as the case made its way toward trial. Nearly a year later, in August of 2021, the capital murder trial began in a Tarrant County courtroom, presided over by Judge Elizabeth Beach. For the first 2 days, prosecutors built their case methodically, laying out the DNA evidence, the genealogy work, the timeline stretching back to 1974. On the second day, jurors sat in silence as they listened to McCurley's own voice, recorded in that interrogation room, admitting to what he'd done. By the third day, something shifted. On August 24, 2021, 78-year-old Glenn McCurley made a decision. He waived his right to a jury trial. He changed his plea to guilty. And almost immediately, in that same courtroom, Judge Beach sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 47 years after he walked out of a police interview room a free man, Glenn McCurley was finally going to spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the courtroom wasn't finished with him yet. Carla's sister stood and faced the man who had destroyed her family's life for nearly 5 decades. She told him, directly, that he should have confessed long before this, that he had put their family through hell for years they could never get back. And then she said something that would echo far beyond that courtroom. She asked him to confess to any other murders he may have committed, not just for her family's sake, for other families who might still be waiting, still wondering, still searching for answers of their own. It was a question hanging in the air of a Tarrant County courtroom on a single afternoon in August 2021. Were there others? Glenn McCurley didn't answer it that day. And as it turned out, the world would have only 2 more years to find out before the only man who truly knew the answer took it somewhere no investigator could ever reach him again. Glenn McCurley had less than 3 years left to live, and he knew it. He spent those years inside the Telford Unit, a prison in Bowie County, Texas, tucked away near the Arkansas border. No more Quiet Street in far west Fort Worth. No more 30 years of blending in. Just a cell, a number, and whatever thoughts a man carries when he finally has nowhere left to hide from himself. On July 14, 2023, Glenn McCurley died. He was 80 years old. The cause was natural causes, the kind of quiet, unceremonious ending that almost feels like an insult against everything he took from Carla Walker and her family. He had served less than 3 years of a life sentence for a crime that stole 49 years from the people who loved her. And with his death, something else happened. Something Fort Worth detectives had been quietly working on behind the scenes came to an abrupt and permanent halt. In the years after his arrest, investigators hadn't simply closed the book on Glenn McCurley once he confessed to Carla's murder. They'd started looking backward and outward, asking a much darker question. Was Carla Walker truly his only victim? McCurley had lived in the Fort Worth area for decades, moving through the same world as countless other people, completely unsuspected, completely free. Detectives began quietly cross-referencing his history against other unsolved cases in the region, looking for any connection, any pattern, any thread that might tie him to a crime no one had ever solved. That investigation was still active when he died. Whatever McCurley knew, whatever other secrets might have been sitting behind those eyes during his trial, behind that rambling, reluctant confession, it went into the ground with him. The detectives who had spent years chasing down the truth about Carla Walker now found themselves chasing shadows of a different kind, trying to answer questions about a dead man who could no longer be questioned at all. For families of other unsolved cases in the Fort Worth area, Families who may have spent years wondering if the man responsible for their own tragedy was finally behind bars. McCurley's death meant the door to those answers may now be closed forever. But if anyone understood how to keep fighting even when a door closes, it was Carla's family. For nearly 50 years, Carla's brother, Jim Walker, had refused to let his sister's case fade into a forgotten file. He was the one who stood in front of cameras the day McCurley was finally arrested, the one who said the word that had been sitting in his chest for decades the moment he got the call. Finally, he had pushed and pushed and pushed police departments to never stop looking, long after most people would have given up hope that an answer would ever come. Now, with his sister's killer dead and buried, Jim Walker turned his fight into something bigger than one family, one case, one murderer. He took what had happened to Carla and to his family and carried it all the way to Washington. U.S. Senators John Cornyn and Peter Welch introduced legislation in Congress called the Carla Walker Act, named directly after the case that had finally proven, on a national stage, just how powerful forensic genetic genealogy could be. The proposed bill would create a federal pilot grant program, funding at least $5 million a year, according to figures pushed by the Walker family's advocacy, to help cold case units across the entire country access the same kind of advanced DNA testing that finally caught Glenn McCurley. As of now, the act remains proposed legislation, introduced in Congress but not yet signed into law. A bill still working its way through the same kind of slow, grinding process that took Carla's own case nearly 5 decades to resolve. For Jim Walker, the meaning behind that legislation goes far beyond his own sister's case. It's about every other Carla Walker sitting in a file somewhere, in a department somewhere, in a culvert or a field or an unmarked grave somewhere, waiting for technology and persistence to finally catch up to the person responsible. As Jim Walker put it himself, this kind of science changes the equation entirely for killers who think enough time has passed for them to be safe. It's no longer a matter of if they get caught. It's only a matter of when. Carla Walker never got to finish that Valentine's dance. She never got to grow old, never got to become the veterinarian she dreamed of being, never got to watch her own life unfold the way it should have. She was 17 years old, tiny but mighty, full of life, and then she was gone, taken by a man who spent the next 46 years of his life walking free, living quietly, just miles away from everyone who loved her. But in the end, Carla's case became something larger than her own tragedy. It became proof of what's possible when science, persistence, and a family's refusal to give up finally collide. It rewired how cold cases are solved in America, and it may end up rewriting how the entire country funds the fight to bring closure to thousands of other families still waiting for their own answers. So here's a question worth sitting with. Do you think Glenn McCurley had other victims the world will never know about? Drop your theory in the comments below. And if you want to be here for the next cold case that DNA finally cracks open, make sure you're subscribed, because this is exactly the kind of story we live for here at XTC Uncovered.